So we're reading an English novel today, so I thought tea would be appropriate. But I'm not much of a tea lover, so I'm drinking a scandalous mango strawberry flavor because I'm really a coffee person, but it'll have to do. Now let's talk Orlando. Orlando is a novel by Virginia Woolf, and it's kind of another one of those novels that I picked up at the bookstore more or less on a hunch. So I have read Virginia Woolf before. I've read Mrs. Dalloway twice because I didn't understand it the first time, so I had to reread it. And then I read To the Lighthouse, and then I read A Room of One's Own. So when I picked up Orlando, I kind of knew what I was getting into. I didn't know much about the novel itself or what happens in it, so in that sense, the book has been quite a revelation. I really loved it, although I do kind of have a bit of a beef with it. Not really with the book, but with most of the interpretations and analysis I've found online of it. Right before chapter 1, there is a dedication to V. Sackville West. This dedication is by Virginia Woolf to Vida Sackville West, with whom she has had a long friendship and at some point even a romantic relationship. And it has been confirmed, I think, by Vida Sackville West's son, let's say, that the novel is in fact a kind of a metaphoric exploration of their relationship, or in some way dedicated to it. But my problem is that I really dislike reading fiction and then realizing that it's not really fiction, it's kind of autobiographical, and actually in order to understand it, you need to go on this online search to find out basically everything you can about the author's private life in order to understand the book. I don't like it. I feel like I'm being lured. I feel like, you're giving me this one thing under the pretense of it being fiction, but actually it's your invitation to get me to be interested in your own life. Now, I don't know if this is what Virginia Woolf wanted to do. I don't know if she wanted people to interpret the book itself in terms of her relationship with Vida, but I don't like to do that, and I'm not going to do that. I think fiction is fiction for a reason, and I do expect the works of fiction that I read to be able to stand on their own, and for the readers to be able to get something out of the book, even if they're not really interested in who their authors were in their own private lives. I don't know if that's an unpopular opinion, but I do plan on talking about this book without any reference to the relationship between Virginia Woolf and Vida Sackville West. I will solely focus on what do I think about Orlando. If I would be perfectly honest, I actually absolutely love this book. And I actually find it kind of reductive to only interpret it in terms of Virginia's private life, because this book has so much else to offer. It's about a person that lives like 200 or 300 years, and a person that changes gender midway through the novel, and it deals with so many incredible topics like beauty and love and death and melancholy and imagination, and there is so much to say about it. So let's talk about Orlando. So in terms of the structure, the novel is actually quite simple. Orlando is imagined as a biography of a fictional character. It's divided into 6 chapters. Each chapter follows a certain segment of Orlando's life. What's interesting about the book is that, in fact, Orlando is quite an unordinary character. He starts off as a young man in the UK, an aristocrat who will, throughout the story, be sent at some point to Constantinople as the ambassador, and then there What will happen is that Orlando will have a transformation and one day wake up as a woman. And then we will follow her journey back to the UK, kind of watching her perspective shift now after this huge transformation. Another thing that's very unusual is that Orlando, while it is a biography, is a character that lives, I think, 200 or 300 years. So we don't only see the transformation from man to woman, we also see how Orlando perceives and finds their place in different historical epochs. In that sense, it's quite an unusual novel, and what can be a bit tricky is the way Virginia Woolf writes about time, or how time passes by in Orlando's life. When I thought about how to talk about Orlando, I thought that the best way to do it is to kind of separate these big themes that I sort of recognized as I was reading through the novel. The first one and the biggest of all, I thought, was poetry. So Orlando is an incredibly poetic novel, both in terms of the language in which it was written, but also in the terms of the main character being, deep down in their soul, a poet. Since I'm going to talk about poetry, I have to mention that I'm not a native English speaker. And since that is the case, even though I read the novel in English, it has been an incredibly challenging read. It has been a lot of Googling words, focusing, and my book looks like, just look at this. It's just underlined all over the place with notes and all sorts of stuff that I have to scribble in order to not lose my focus and not misunderstand something. Despite that, it is so worth it. The language is so beautiful. It's like honey dripping from your mouth with every word you read. But anyway, as it comes to poetry as part of Orlando's life, I think it's really obvious from the very beginning that Orlando is this very poetic and dramatic and romantic soul. We meet Orlando first as a very young man who is an aristocrat in England and lives kind of in his own little universe in this huge wealthy estate with servants and helpers and dogs and beautiful gardens, I would say, the way I imagined it at least. And Orlando is a character that you see constantly contemplates life and gets hooked on these like small moments, like when he passes through a hall of one of his houses, I guess, and sees this old man sitting at a table, and he thinks he's part of the help, but he's not sure, but he sees him sitting at the table, and I think the man is maybe writing something, and Orlando just immediately gets locked into that image and starts contemplating, is he writing poetry? And he gets fascinated by this character, and this really consumes him, this thought. Because Orlando is somebody who lives a lot in his own fantasy in that part of the book. He has this incredible need to connect with nature, to be outside, to sit under his favorite tree, to observe the flowers and the sky and the clouds and everything you could possibly think of. And he really feels a deep connection with nature because, and I think even, at least in my copy of the book, there is a little like blurb or a quote on the back that says, he loved to feel the earth's spine beneath him. It's a very emotional aspect of the book, the whole poetry thing, especially since Orlando, he has this poem that he starts writing when he's very young and that he will take with him on the journey to Constantinople and then back with her on the journey to the UK, and you watch this poem follow the main character throughout their life, transforming and changing and soaking up experiences that they've had. And it's such a beautiful thought that something like that could exist, some beautiful symbolic piece of art that changes and grows together with us throughout life, and that you can maybe have a look at the end of your life. The beginning of Orlando really hits home in terms of this emotional aspect of writing and the emotional connection with the main character that I, at least, very, very deeply felt. Orlando is, in every way, shape, and form, absolutely obsessed with writing and reading and with literature in general. And there is this beautiful passage in chapter 2, I believe, where Orlando describes literature as this infection that if you get, totally consumes you. Now, aside from the poetic part, as a character, Orlando starts off as a young man who's very passionate, very nature-loving, and very boyishly playful, I would say, also. He is quite connected. He's an aristocrat and connected to the high court, and already in the first chapter, he meets the Queen of England, who is completely infatuated with him. I think that the infatuation was grounded in the fact that he was so young and had such a huge appetite for life and love and everything. And the Queen is presented as somebody who's quite old and maybe nearing the end of her life. It is implied that it's Queen Elizabeth, if I don't remember wrong. Orlando isn't really returning the infatuation back. He is kind of I don't know if I'd say a playboy, but he does get around with quite a lot of other characters. He chases women, I would say, and easily falls in love, easily falls out of love. And you follow him through all these kind of maybe less significant relationships until he meets this character, this Russian princess, Sasha, who he just truly and deeply falls in love with. And she returns the feeling, and they have this beautiful romance that's described so incredibly in the novel. And it's heartbreaking because in the end she has to leave. She's going back to Russia and he's not ready to follow her. He's also promised to another woman, so there's that. And when Sasha leaves, it really breaks his heart, and he sinks into this deep melancholy after that. And in that sense, I felt like Orlando was also quite relatable because he's so young and he takes everything, or like everything feels so big. You know, when you're young and you believe that, you know, the world begins and ends with every relationship you begin and end with someone, and these emotions really carry you through life. And Orlando is a very, very emotional character. He kind of uses poetry to process through all the feelings that he deeply, deeply, deeply feels inside of himself. Now, when Orlando feels things, he feels them deeply. It is almost like an earthquake is going on inside of him, and he wants to experience it to the fullest, both the good and the bad. Well, there is this kind of a gentle sadness that runs through the entire novel in Orlando's life. There is this one big part of it, and almost the whole chapter of the book is dedicated to it, after the Russian princess leaves him, when it really strikes him hard. In that period, Orlando is described as kind of seeking solitude, avoiding others, not eating, sleeping really long. And at the beginning, when you read about it, you just feel like you're reading about this kind of classical post-breakup depression. But after reflecting on it a bit, I feel like there's something special about how Orlando does it, because he finds himself in this new emotional state where he needs to deal with abandonment. And what he does is he allows himself to completely sink in to this feeling of sorrow. He immerses himself into his own darkness to the fullest. It makes me feel like he allows himself to be present right there where he is. There is a great passage from the novel that also where he says how scary it is to realize that you're just standing still in this one moment, and how shocking it is to be able to survive that. But after reading that passage, I feel like I've realized that it takes a lot of courage and a lot of wisdom to allow yourself to do that. In a sense, it doesn't really imply a lack of agency as one might imagine, because there is this inner agency happening where Orlando does all this inner work with his feelings. So he kind of observes them and is aware of them and explores what might they bring to him or where might they take him. On the other hand, he also still expresses literal agency. So in this deep dark moment, he actually seeks out on his own initiative the company of another poet. I thought that was really symbolic because I've always felt that poetry is that one liberating device, that one form of literature that you don't really have to understand. It's rather about whether or not it evokes something in you, or you can relate to something in the poem that otherwise to you might be kind of untranslatable into words. While on the topic of melancholy, I feel like Orlando is also very preoccupied with death, both death and life, but he approaches death in a bit of a different way, not simply as in an ending to life, because Orlando's sense of time will be quite different than what us mortals are used to, as Orlando will live 200 or 300 years. Orlando observes death, what I took from it, as this kind of a loss or disappearance of something meaningful from our lives. There is also a passage about that, which I think is in chapter 2, and it's a really beautiful one. So when I think of death in this other way as Orlando, I believe, thinks of it, it feels almost like these small daily doses of death are our way of preparing for that big final act of learning how to let go and move on. Now, Virginia Woolf has a very specific way of writing about time, and time is an important dimension of her work. It's also a very important dimension of Orlando, not just in terms of his very long life in the end, but also in terms of how that time passes in the novel. This is something that I find both fascinating and really challenging when reading Virginia Woolf, because I don't think it's specific to this novel. For example, I remember that I had that impression very strongly when I read To the Lighthouse, that she has the ability to stretch out a single moment of time to several pages and examine it with such detail and accuracy. She will really zoom in on it. And then there are parts of the novel where you will see centuries pass by, it feels like, in a number of pages. I think she does this because she uses this passage of time to kind of point out, to a certain extent, the relevance of things she is talking about, but also to show how relative time can be as a dimension of our lives. And there is a fantastic passage about the relativity of time in the human being's life. So when I think about time in Orlando, I think of, for example, how fast time passes by in the way she writes about Orlando's many relationships with women in the beginning of the book. Different women until she reaches Princess Sasha from Russia, and then dedicates a huge portion of that chapter to describing in depth their relationship, and sometimes particular moments of their relationship that are relevant to them. And then there's a similar thing happening when it comes to Orlando's post-breakup depression or melancholy. That episode is also analyzed quite up close, and we go into a lot of detail about it, about his sentiments during that period. And then I feel like things kind of speed up when all of a sudden at the end of that chapter, Orlando asks to be appointed ambassador in Constantinople. And then we shift immediately to Constantinople, even though we know it took time to get there. And we don't get to see that in the novel, but we do get to see quite a lot of this one big ceremony that happens in Constantinople after the big fast, the Ramadan there. And that is the night when, after that celebration, that Orlando falls asleep and is visited by these heavenly manifestations, Lady Purity, Lady Chastity, and Lady Modesty. And again, for example, that sleep stretches out because we go deeply into everything that's happening with these three manifestations as he is asleep. And then she wakes up as a woman, and we go from there. And then there is the traveling back all the way to England, which is done which happens much more fast if you think about it. If you compare that section to, for example, the exploration of, I don't know, what it was like to sit under the oak tree and contemplate life in Orlando's head when he was younger. So time moves at different paces across the novel, and it's quite unpredictable in that sense when you read Virginia Woolf, to guess how much space something will get in that particular chapter. And it is quite unpredictable. It's fun to a certain extent. It allows you to kind of dive deeper into certain aspects, but it also makes you reflect, or it made me reflect, on why, for example, towards the end of the novel, Orlando is experiencing this huge historical shift, because we realize at one point that when she goes back to England, Elizabeth is no longer queen. A lot of time has passed by. It is never really clearly defined how long it has been. And we kind of get glimpses and certain details that might point us to at which point, at which moment of time she is in that particular chapter. But things evolve much more rapidly than they did in the beginning of the novel. It felt like in the beginning of the novel, everything was almost slow motion in a certain sense. But then towards the end of the novel, things start to kind of just accelerate, and things happen at such a rapid speed. And at one point you realize that she's in Victorian England, and then you realize that more time has passed by, and you realize that now all of a sudden towards the end of the novel, there are like steam engines and electricity, and things are happening because you are at present time at the time when Virginia Woolf lived. So it's quite a fascinating experiment, because I don't know many other authors that play with time in that sense when they write. But I definitely think that it's a very interesting literary vessel to communicate different ideas. So the time has come to discuss the kind of central event of the book that happens in chapter 3, midway through the novel, and when Orlando actually becomes a woman. Now, Orlando was appointed to Constantinople as the ambassador at his own request, and despite that, in Constantinople, we realize that while he still is perceived as this very vivacious, beautiful person, he isn't really happy there. He is quite reserved. He doesn't really make friends. However, in his role as the ambassador, he decides to make a kind of a celebration at the end of this big fast called the Ramadan, and organize a spectacle after it's done. And there are some rumors that some kind of a miracle will take place, but we don't know really what's going on. And Virginia Woolf kind of veils this event in mystery, because throughout this chapter, as we read, she points out that all the information we have about what's happening is based on some kind of obscure writing by some third person about what had actually happened that night. So we have kind of an unreliable author here. However, what we do find out is that the celebration takes place, and during the celebration, Orlando is being given an honor by a British admiral, and at the moment when that admiral places a kind of a crown, as I imagined it, or I think it's called a coronet, on his head, these strange things kind of start happening. There's a lot of commotion in the crowd. Things start to get weird. And what we know is that after that event, Orlando goes back to his quarters and goes to sleep. And sleeps very soundly through a very turbulent event that's happening in Constantinople, which is that the people are rebelling against the Sultan, and there are rioters all over the place. Some of them even enter Orlando's chambers, but when they see him asleep, they choose not to harm him, but instead just kind of rob him and leave. And in the midst of all that, while Orlando is asleep, 3 heavenly apparitions or manifestations show up. and kind of start, from what I gathered, asking for Orlando's life to be spared. And these apparitions are three ladies. One is Lady Chastity, one is Lady Modesty, and the last one is Lady Purity. And it's very interesting because these three attributes were highly valued in women. And they describe themselves and what they protect and what they stand for, and they say, "Spare, oh spare," every time that they do. And after that, Orlando wakes up. And once he wakes up, he realizes that he has become a woman. So now Orlando is standing there, she's completely naked, and the three ladies kind of hand her a kind of a towel or something to robe herself in. And there is this beautiful moment where you see that Orlando is not really in the maybe way that one would expect, disturbed by what had happened. She kind of acknowledges her new body. She notices that her physique has changed. She acknowledges that she will now have to kind of continue on as a woman. And I think Virginia Woolf even says that she's kind of, her future has been changed by the fact that she has become a woman, but her identity had not. And I thought that was really interesting because there is this fantastic quote about Orlando experiencing so many transformations throughout the novel, and yet feeling that in the depths of her soul, she is still the same person she has been from the beginning of the novel. So the reason why I find this so interesting and so important is because it points out how much of the ideas of ourselves that we have, we might sometimes relate to gender when they in fact are ideas that are just plain and simply traits of our character as it would have been regardless of the body we were given at birth. And it's really wonderful to see somebody exploring that without some kind of inherent trauma related to the fact that the body has been changed, but instead observing it, and we will see Orlando in the future kind of coming to terms with what implications her new body now has for the rest of her life. Because right now she's still in Constantinople, and after the transformation or the miracle, she will join a group of gypsies for a while and live with them. However, she will have this kind of strange sense of not belonging or not fitting in, and eventually decide to board a ship and sail back to her homeland. So the Enamoured Lady is the title of the ship that Orlando will board in order to sail back to England, to her homeland. And on this journey, she will experience a series of reflections, which will obviously continue even in her homeland, but a first series of deep reflections upon the societal expectations of her now that she is a woman. And I really love how this is done in the book because Orlando is very introspective and very honest about herself. And she even reflects, both on the ship and later on as she returns to England, on the fact that this idea that she is now seen differently is something that always existed and that she herself used to practice as a man, but didn't really recognize it in time. And there's a really good quote about that where she kind of wonders Does she now have to respect the opinions of a sex that she maybe finds repulsive? And while she reflects on that, she also kind of acknowledges that a lot of the expectations that exist around women are expectations that come from society, and that there is a lot about how you see those expectations and how they will affect you. And the interesting bit is that she doesn't really see it like society as inherently good or bad. It just is. And then she talks about how you position yourself and how you perceive it is how it will shape the effect it will have on you. So I found this really, really powerful, but I also found it good that she notes later on that while that may be the case, society does have certain rules that can feel quite brutal. And she notes in another part of this chapter that society tends to be more brutal or treat people more brutally if they go against it rather than bend to it. In many ways, one can wonder how much Orlando actually wishes to transform her behavior now that she's a woman, rather than acting in the way that she actually wants to act, considering that she had spent, I think she says like something about 30 years being a man. She uses her experience from being a man to kind of compare her status in society and her possibilities in a society to what they were before. So, for example, many things change. When she reaches her homeland and goes back to her estate, she realizes that her rights to the estate are now disputed, amongst other things also on the grounds of her being a woman. And what I really like about this chapter is that Orlando is written in a way in which you seem to feel like there is some kind of nonchalance involved in perceiving and experiencing these societal obstacles to her as she is a woman. At times, it feels like they frustrate her a lot, but at other times, it feels like, she sees the society being fucked up, but she also doesn't have a lot of energy to deal with it. She continues her journey, and even though once in England, it's not literally a physical journey, she uses her new perspective as a woman to get a new grasp of the society she used to live in as a man. And in doing so, she kind of starts attending these social gatherings of people of higher class, and now with the new eyes or the new perspective she has, she kind of starts seeing how performative everything about their behavior is. There are very specific social codes that dictate how they should behave because they belong to a certain milieu of society, and they tend to stick to those rules because deviating from them can be quite dangerous. But she also starts to observe different segments of society. So she does attend for a while these social gatherings of the higher class, but she also takes the opportunity to, for example, meet sex workers from the street, infiltrate herself in their company, and then listen to their stories about how they came to be in that position that they work as sex workers. And this is a really fantastic exploration about the general nature of performativity of a lot of roles we have in society. And I find that some of Orlando's reflections on womanhood and on what expectations there are of women and men and how different we actually are really awakening. So at one point she realizes that she is, as a woman, appalled to see another man cry. But then she stops and looks back and says, but I used to be a man, and I know that they cry as much as women do. They just maybe choose not to do it in front of others, so that when they're seen crying, it seems appalling. That was one of them. Another one was at the very beginning when she is on the ship and still sailing to England. There is a moment where I think either her ankle or her wrist are exposed when on the deck, and one of the sailors sees that, and she gets really worried and preoccupied that she's somehow provoking him with her appearance. And she starts thinking about how this might impact him and how he might behave because of that. And kind of instantly starts feeling some kind of responsibility for that. But then again, she stops for a moment and she kind of looks back and she says, but why should I bear the responsibility? Is really the sight of my ankle or my wrist enough to make this other completely grown-up human being act in some strange way? That should be on him and not on me. There's a series of these moments and they're really, really interesting to read. So this chapter has been completely insane in that sense, and it made me reflect so much about the importance of constantly re-examining where we come from when we have certain expectations of other people, and kind of examining why we expect those particular things. But also at the same time, while perhaps being very kind of self-inquisitive and introspective and thinking about her prior experiences as a man, she also starts to kind of acknowledge that there is a form of, I don't know if suffering is the word I want to use, but definitely there is a constant frustration with the world when you live in it as a woman, because there is this fantastic passage about how she knows that no matter how well men treat her, it doesn't really guarantee her their respect. As in, the male treatment of women is kind of a performance for how you're supposed to be around them, but not really a reflection of how you actually feel about them. So towards the end of the novel, we note a change and a picking up of the pace, so to say. So the change I saw was primarily in Orlando, who was questioning the society a lot in the previous chapter and had a lot of reflections on how society expects men and women to behave and how she needed to adapt her performances of herself in the society based on her body. But in these last two chapters, what I note is kind of Orlando giving into society. I want to say even getting tamed by it. There is a moment in the novel where Orlando starts to notice that everybody around her has a wedding ring on their finger, and she desperately starts wanting one. She feels all of a sudden incredibly alone and calls it not only loneliness but matelessness in a sense. However, I don't really feel, and this is the trouble I've had with it, I didn't really feel like this loneliness was there to begin with. It felt very artificially induced by the society around her. So there is this very funny scene where Orlando, in this moment of desperation, goes out for a walk outside, and as she's walking, she sprains her ankle and falls, and she's lying there like completely given up and tired of everything and completely worn out without any desire to even try to get up. And then in this kind of a Prince Charming moment, a man walks into her life and helps her up. And as Virginia Woolf puts it, moments later they were engaged. And they did, in fact, even get married. In a matter of a few lines, Orlando found, according to the book, basically her soulmate, because she falls so deeply in love with this man. On the one hand, I don't want to question it because her feelings seem genuine. On the other hand, since I did perceive her loneliness as artificially induced and I see all of this happening rapidly, it makes me wonder as if this marriage was something she really wanted. But I'm wondering if that's the actual point, that sometimes society can induce us with needs that we, in the end, internalize so much that we perceive them as our own. Now, throughout the marriage, I didn't see her as unhappy in it or oppressed in any way. This man has some kind of a job like a sailor or something, and this is the reason why he's not really there a lot. So we don't see the two of them a lot in interaction. Rather, he's constantly out on some journey because of his work. And every time something meaningful happens in Orlando's life, she finds a way to contact him, to write a letter, to send a telegram. I don't know if she even calls him at the very end. So she does seem happy and she does seem to have a true connection to him. But there is another change, and it began with how fast she fell in love with him. But then it continued. It's like time started to speed up towards the end of the novel, and we follow Orlando in this ecstatic exploration of the city she lives in and of the world around her as it undergoes this huge transformation, because time does literally speed up there. And all of a sudden, she is noticing so many historical changes. Like, you can see literally that epochs are coming one after the other. She notices for the first time a carriage that's not drawn by horses, which is an implication that cars have shown up. And then she drives a car, she smokes cigars, her life changes a lot. She even runs into that poet whom she met when she was a young man, suffering because Sasha had left her. And they also talk about how the writing world has changed and how everything has become so fast that people are basically writing things just to earn some money, and it's not so much anymore about the essence of what is written, so long as you can get something published. It's quite interesting to see her observing this changing world and kind of trying to figure out what is changing, because she has a moment where she says, everything has changed, but nothing has changed. I think she still has this very strong feeling of groundedness in herself, in who she is, and she doesn't feel like she's changed so much as a person in terms of her identity, but she's noticed how the performance of the world, how everything seems different, appears different, functions differently. And I love this last part. I love this ecstatic exploration of her surroundings and how time just warps up, and we even see her having a child, which is given very little space, which was kind of surprising to me. Yes, at some point we reach this moment when it is dark and the clock strikes midnight, and it is October 11th, 1928, I believe. And the novel ends on a Thursday. It is nighttime, and I've drunk tea, and I've eaten fruit, and I've eaten cake. And the cake wasn't as good as I thought it would be, but you win some, you lose some. And it's time to wrap things up. and it's time for me to go to bed. My main take from Orlando is that it is an absolutely outstanding and amazing exploration of life. What is life is the question that Orlando asks, and I think she herself is the answer, because that's what she does all the time. She kind of goes through it and examines it and reflects on it and figures things out along the way, trying to find answers to all these big questions that pop up in her head. And what I love about it is that it's ended in such an open way, because we don't know what happens with Orlando. We don't need to know. And we don't get any pre-made answers served to us. Rather, we are invited to kind of think together with her about all these big topics she encountered and thought about. If I would count the takes that I will bring with me from this book: read more poetry. Don't worry about time so much. It is relative, much more relative than you can imagine. Go through life with an open mind. Shift perspectives is such an incredible book. It is a book that, even though I say that this is just, an analysis from the perspective of somebody who likes to read, not a scholarly one, I almost felt sad that I wasn't some kind of a literary academic that can analyze this book at the level of every sentence and every word, because it's so beautifully written. It is completely breathtaking. I would definitely recommend Orlando. I think I would definitely recommend anything written by Virginia Woolf, because it is so rich and colorful and vivid and full of emotion that it truly is an experience to read any one of her works. So until next time.